What do these three characters have in common? Besides the fact that they're Egyptian gods, they have something extra in common that we need to talk about, and perhaps in another video in great detail, especially considering how important it is to remind ourselves about who these people are. So let's first start with a couple things, right? Notice the features that are being thrown at these people. Okay, so a mix between animal and human. So the last one is probably the most famous one, called Bes. His face is obviously an African, but it's not his face that gives that away. It's his origins. Bes is thought to have originated in Nubia, and his name gives that away because the word Bisu means cat in Old Nubian. And we know that he himself has been compared to a cat several times in ancient Egypt. And there's many other stories about, his origin in Nubia and the fact that the pygmy thing and all of that. But that's only one person that we're talking about. And of course, I don't want to neglect his thing that he's wearing on his neck, which is very typical of Nubian. And remember, all the priests I've shown you from Akhmim, from all these other places in Egypt, that they wear that Nubian traditional dress. They wear that around their neck. And Bes, very popular god, is represented with this whole Nubian thing going on. Now remember, this is not a small connection between Nubia and the ancient Egyptians, because they venerated this person. They did not look at him like, oh, he's cool or whatever. They venerated this person. They looked up to this god. Okay, so then we move on to the second one, and the lion is who we're looking at. And this lion, again, Nubian worshipped first and then moved to Egypt. And there's a whole narrative about her and Ra. And Ra and her are basically inseparable in the beginning of the ancient Egyptian texts. And you see her run away from Egypt and go straight to Nubia, return to Nubia, and then return back when she's ascended. Then at the end, we have another Nubian god, Melul, or Mendelus, but Melul is his name. And Melul is another Nubian god who is then worshipped both in Nubia and Egypt. So, what's the connection between these three? It's that they are Nubian in origin. But they're not just Nubian in origin, they're also worshipped in Egypt very early in the history, meaning that, we can talk about how the Nubians continued to worship Egyptian gods well into like 300 AD or whatever, but we can see here that Egyptians worshipped ancient Nubian gods as far back as 2600 BC. 2600 BC, and they're worshiping the gods of other lands in their lands, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why the south part of Egypt, which we call Upper Egypt, the old people used to call it Upper Egypt. The reason why Upper Egypt is considered, so close to Nubia is because anything that's kind of, I don't want to use the word a fad in Egypt, but anything that's kind of a thing that you see, a ritualistic thing, you will see it in Nubia and the southern part of Egypt. And so even though I point out myself that the people of Egypt were not limited to the south part of Egypt, they definitely were closer connected, strictly due to a couple things, geography, obviously. But this does not mean that the people of the southern part of Egypt were like fake Egyptians and the ones in the north were like real Egyptians. They all were real Egyptians, and you saw them. Most of them were depicted with the exact same color, a brownish color. It's just that a lot of the traditions that were Nubian, quote unquote, I mean, I use that word just to mean people who were just down south, below Egypt. And something that's very interesting about that area is because we talk about it a lot, but something that's very interesting is, and I've been trying to resolve this issue in my head for a while, and I can't resolve it in my head. It's actually a very difficult problem. The fact that the Nubian languages, the Nilotic languages, are not Afro-Asiatic. That's weird. That's actually a very strange thing that Egypt is an Afro-Asiatic land. It's an Afro-Asiatic country. The Berber regions are Afro-Asiatic. Just south of the Nilotic people is another, I would call them Nilotic people as well, but another group of people, the Ethiopians, the Abyssinians, and all these other people, but they're Afro-Asiatic, but they skip. Like you have to first go over these other people who speak Nilotic languages. And this problem would be easy to resolve. You just go, okay, well, I guess the Nubians are just very different than the ancient Egyptians, but they're not. As we can see right here, their gods are the same. The gods of Egypt are the same as the gods of Nubia. And also their connection is the same. But somehow the Nubians kept their language uncompromised for a very long time. They kept it still, stuck in one location, and the several different tribes did not throw away any of their thing. And of course, you know, if a bunch of if a bunch of Asiatics had brought the languages to Africa, right? Why not Nubia? Why not the Nilotic regions? I'm not saying there's no Afro-Asiatic languages, but the majority of languages in those regions were Nilotic. They were not Afro-Asiatic. Why not that area? Now, if we look at this map, we can see, and I've put in the picture of the Beja people. It's not, it's not part of the image, but I put it in for a reason. These Blemmies, which there was a mythical version of it and the real one, but these were real people called the Blemmies, and their language is Afro-Asiatic. So not all the people who lived south of the ancient Egyptians were necessarily not, Afro-Asiatic. But if you look at Kush, running through the Nile, the real Nilotics running through the Nile, that whole region is Nilotic in terms of languages. And again, we have a smattering of Afro-Asiatic. I'm not saying there was none, but for the most part, it was that. But then you move on the other side of, Sudan, you have yourself Chad. But here's the problem. Chad is Afro-Asiatic. How did that Nilotic block stay still in that region? What is it about the Nilotic language that made it not go away when so many other languages? And of course, the reason why I bring this up, it's not because I want to restate things I've already stated. The reason I bring it up is because this is further evidence that it wasn't a replacement that happened, but it was languages. This is my theory based on other people's theories. I'm not making it up. Um, it's obvious that these languages were there before. These were pre-established. Because if there was a movement in, if there was different groups coming in, right? So let's say they start from, you know, the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. They move into Egypt, and some of them move in through Ethiopia, through the little gap right there, and they spread in, and they start to move inland, and the Blemmyes region becomes Afroasiatic, the Chadic regions become Afroasiatic, the Ethiopian regions become Afroasiatic, including the North African regions and everywhere, including Nigeria. People forget that Niger, especially, not Nigeria, but Niger more than Nigeria, becomes Afroasiatic. But that one little block right there, it means that they somehow went around that region. But if it was just another language, then there was no real competition, right? Like it wasn't like it was new people replacing old people. It was just, there you go, just another one of these languages in Africa, and it happens to remain because they were just, it had always existed at the same time. Now I want to remind people. People didn't care when I said this the first time. I think I said this like 10 months ago, but at some point someone claimed that the Hadza were Afroasiatic, but a lot of scholars came out to debunk that immediately. Now, why would someone ever claim something like that the Hadza are Afroasiatic? Well, the reason is because it has to make sense if the Afroasiatics, like I'm trying to tell you right now, if the Afroasiatics came from Europe, well, came from the Middle East and moved into Africa, it has to make sense somehow that if you go to Tanzania down there, where they're thought to have gone, then their language should have spread there too. Otherwise, you prove that Middle Eastern people moved into certain regions and had virtually no impact in those regions. Even if they got there, they had no impact, not linguistically, not, not really in any way, really. Because if you look at the Hadza, they still live, the way Africans used to live tens of thousands of years ago. So you're talking about not just limited impact, no impact. But then that brings up the question: if they had no impact on the Hadza, they had limited to no impact on the Nubians, limited to no impact on other regions of Africa which are close to these areas, then what impact could they, how could they have had so much impact on some place like Chad, for example, to the point where the language is fully adopted? It must be that the language has nothing to do with the people who come from the Middle East. Now, the question then should be, well, what if we do it the other way around? Now, I know this video is supposed to be about the religion, but this is more important. What if we do it the other way around? Is there anything from Africa that we can show in the Middle East that shows that, okay, yeah, yes, we can? Because the areas that are not close to Africa speak completely different languages, almost language isolates, showing how old they are compared to the Afroasiatic that then came in, meaning the Afroasiatic language came later. And not only that, we can see we can see that um, there's a shift when the Afroasiatics come into the Sumerian regions and we start seeing writing in Afroasiatic, meaning that language was not there simultaneously from the beginning. I mean, in the Middle East, some of the earliest writing goes back to like, I don't know, 5000 BC. Like, goes really far back, but the earliest Afroasiatic writing is about 2600 BC, 2300 BC, which in Egypt is like 3200 BC. So we got 1,000 years on them, meaning that if the Akkadians or somebody like that had brought the language to Egypt, then they brought an already existing language, which would be strange. Now, so how does this tie to the religion? Well, First of all, Hadza, we're talking about pygmoids, we're talking about all these other things, we're talking about lions, we're talking about all these connections, but all of the gear that these gods are wearing scream Africa. And not only that, forget what they're wearing, forget all of that. The way they're wearing them. I want to show you one of the earliest kings of the Semitic regions. And remember, nature leads people to do what they do. Nature leads people to become who they are. Wait, before we go to that, let me first talk about something because now I just remembered what I wanted to say about Bess. That's the interesting thing about Bess. If we zoom into him, we can see that unlike a lot of other things, people, no matter what gods, humanoids, unlike a lot of them in ancient Egypt, he's got a beard. It's a very interesting beard as well, but he's got a beard. I just want to acknowledge that. Remember, Bess is Sudanese, but I want to acknowledge that because obviously, if I'm going to bring up Sumerians, beards are going to come up all over the place, and this continues till this day. If you've ever met Arab people in your life, you know that hair is one of the things that is like a defining feature. It's a defining feature for a lot of people who are sort of whatever that type of people from India and those regions. But it's important that we acknowledge it in those regions because you just keep seeing it as early as possible. Almost like everything else that I show you that is as early as possible. It's like if you see something consistent and repeated for thousands and thousands of years, at some point you have to assume that it wasn't just a cultural style. You have to assume that it wasn't just a cultural thing. It wasn't just something that was inherited or borrowed or whatever. You have to just assume that there's something about the nature of a certain type of people that would lead them down that path. Just like how, you know, um, this is hard to say, but I have to say it. Without the introduction of like Europeans making black people realize, like, want to put on European style hair or Asian style hair in the head, the obvious thing to do with the hair, to braid it or cut it. That was the obvious thing. That's just our nature. It's just the nature of being a, I guess what the Arabs used to call a bald person. But that's just the nature of being a African with the type of hair that we have. It curls up and without, again, without taking too much influence from other people, you have very limited things you can do with it, which of course people put all kinds of styles on their head. But one of the most typical that is not stylist, that's not a style based thing, is going to be to cut it off, which they did, including the woman, which is something you do not see in Asia at any point, at any place. And the only evidence they have for cutting hair being popular in Egypt to get rid of lice is Herodotus talking about priests shaving their entire body, which is not fair to use that as evidence for, you know, people in Egypt being, oh yeah, even the women cut their hair because of, like I've shown you, there's lots of pictures of women in Egypt who have long hair attached to their head, not through a wig. So did those women just never get lice? It's weird. Now, obviously, and also it's not just lice, there's other stuff that crawls into your hair that you need to get rid of your hair for. So now let's talk about the first god, Mandalus or Mendelus or Melus, which I think is a better name, Melus. Let's talk about how we find, even in the Roman times, we find carvings like these ones. For example, this bird thing, the Ba of Mendelus, we find it depicted by the Nubians and by the Romans and by the Egyptians. in Calabasha, a temple in Calabasha. And we also find that the ancient Egyptians had written about victories over the Blemis, which are thought to be the ancestral people of the Beja people. So we find Nubians fighting other dark-skinned Africans. That excuse that people say that people who are dark-skinned aren't going to fight each other, but we find Nubians fighting other dark-skinned Blemis and basically winning. The Nubians, the Sudanese people, win, even though it was still probably a Roman thing at the time. We can see that just because you're dark skinned doesn't mean you're not going to fight against your lookalike neighbor. But then it comes back to the question that I asked, which is, why would those tribes remain non-Egyptian in terms of their writing and reading, the common language of ancient Egyptians, the huge language of ancient Egyptians, the Afro-Asiatic one? Why wouldn't they pick that up? What loyalty did they have to the other Nilotics that made them keep that language? Why is it that Nubians would go to Egypt and still continue to speak their languages? The answer probably is that those languages were sacred in Egypt. And so you don't force it out of people if it's seen as a sacred language.